Summer 1941, the sun beat down mercilessly over the frozen fields that had somehow begun to thaw, melting into mud that clung to the tracks of the German panzers like a stubborn warning. Smoke from engine exhaust mingled with the haze of distant gunfire, a dull roar that the panzer crews barely noticed. For them, victory was a foregone conclusion. They had come for Moscow, confident, arrogant, certain that nothing the Soviets could muster would stop their march. Look at these relics. Hauptmann Weber laughed, his voice cutting across the muddy plain. He gestured toward a cluster of small, clunky Soviet tanks crawling awkwardly through the terrain. Do you call that armor? A child could punch through that with a hammer. His men chuckled. Their confidence as thick as the dust clinging to their boots, Germans always measured power in steel. In the roar of their guns and in the precision of their tactics. They had panzers sleek, fast, deadly. The Russians, by contrast, seemed to field nothing but slow, outdated machines, barely able to cross the fields without getting stuck in the mud. Yet, even as they laughed, Weber's second-in-command squinted toward the horizon. Something moved with unusual speed, something the men had not expected. Perhaps just another toy, Weber said dismissively, waving off the concern. No Russian tank could possibly match a Panzer. Not today, not ever. But there was an edge in his voice, a flicker of unease, fleeting but undeniable. His men noticed it but chose to ignore it, convinced their guns and their confidence were enough. As the columns rolled forward, the soldiers joked and recounted tales of previous victories. "One shot, one kill," muttered Lieutenant Fischer, patting the side of his panzer. "The Soviets are doomed before they even fire." The air was thick with bravado, and even the distant echoes of battle seemed to play along with their certainty. Yet, somewhere beyond the mud and smoke, unseen eyes watched. A whisper of metal, a shadow of something they had never faced before, moved across the fields, silent but deadly. The Wehrmacht did not yet know that the battlefield itself was about to shift beneath their tracks, that the machines they mocked would soon crush their confidence and challenge everything they believed about war. In that moment, the arrogance of the German commanders hung like a storm cloud over the plain, blinding them to the reality waiting just beyond the horizon. The first hints of a weapon the likes of which they had never imagined, a tank that could outgun, outmaneuver, and outlast anything in the German arsenal, lurked just out of sight. And when it finally revealed itself, the laughter would die. The fields, bright and deceptively peaceful under the summer sun, held their secret. And the men who mocked the Soviets would soon learn that underestimation was a dangerous mistake. The first shadow of the T-34 had crossed their path, and the war they thought they controlled was about to turn into something far more deadly than any of them had anticipated. The mud clung to everything: boots, treads, and the edges of helmets, but the German panzers rolled forward with mechanical confidence. Intelligence reports had spoken vaguely of new Soviet tanks, but the crews treated them as another exaggeration. The same tales that had followed every campaign, overblown warnings that barely survived the trip from headquarters to the front lines. "Another fairy tale," muttered Oberleutnant Kruger, brushing a smear of dirt from his uniform. "The Russians have nothing that can match our panzers." But the first hint of something different appeared that morning. A shadow moving faster than any Soviet tank had the right to move. It was distant at first, a dark blur against the golden fields, yet it carried an aura that the men could not ignore. The reports had said new model, but the men laughed at the thought. They had seen too many new models vanish after one encounter with German firepower. Then the first T-34 rolled into view. Its silhouette was low, sleek, and almost alien. Sloped armor glinted under the weak sun, catching light in a way that seemed designed to mock the German gun crews. Its wide tracks carved through the mud effortlessly, leaving no evidence of slowing, while its 76mm gun large, precise, and deadly, aimed without hesitation. Every detail of the tank screamed efficiency, a design born not from arrogance, but from necessity. At first, the Germans refused to believe it. "It can't be real," said Feldwebel Richter. "No tank moves like that and survives a single hit." They continued their advance, firing shells at the distant machine. The round struck, but to their horror, glanced harmlessly off the sloped armor. The T-34 seemed untouchable, almost laughing at their attempts. Whispers spread along the Panzer columns. Reports from scouts and reconnaissance teams trickled in. These tanks were not isolated. They were part of a coordinated, mobile force. They could pivot quickly, maneuver across terrain that would bog down even the heaviest German Panzers, and fire with accuracy that defied expectation. The crew of one Panzer paused as a T-34 moved past a line of trees, disappearing and reappearing in the smoke and dust, almost like a ghost. Hauptmann Weber cursed under his breath, an emotion unfamiliar and unwelcome. "Keep your heads. It's just one tank," he ordered, though even he struggled to believe it. Every encounter, every brief skirmish only added to the dread. German soldiers began to notice patterns. T-34s striking from unexpected angles, retreating into cover when attacked, and emerging again as if conjured from the earth itself. Their initial laughter turned into muttered doubts, but still they pressed forward, clinging to the hope that one decisive strike could restore their certainty. Meanwhile, the Soviet engineers who had created this marvel could not have anticipated the disbelief it would inspire among their adversaries. Every rivet, every sloped plate, and every inch of track had been meticulously designed to exploit German weaknesses. It was not just a tank. It was a statement, one that the Wehrmacht would soon be forced to confront in full force. As the sun dipped lower, shadows stretching across the mud-choked fields, a subtle unease settled over the German troops. Reports came faster now, scouts returning with wide-eyed horror, panicked radio calls of Panzers being disabled without warning. The first inklings of fear, once dismissed as imagination, took root. The T-34 was no fairy tale. It was real, it was here, and it was changing the battlefield in ways the Germans had never imagined. And while the men tried to cling to their confidence, the stark truth began to pierce their armor of arrogance. They were about to face a weapon unlike anything they had ever known. By the time night fell, the fields were quiet, but the tension lingered. Somewhere out there, moving in the shadows, the T-34 awaited, and the men of the Wehrmacht could only wonder if their Panzers would ever be enough. The wind whipped across the frozen plains outside Moscow, carrying with it the sharp scent of smoke and iron. The German panzer columns advanced in precise formation, engines growling, treads biting into the thin crust of ice and mud. Every officer felt the thrill of inevitability. Moscow, they believed, was theirs for the taking. Soldiers joked about the primitive Russians and their outdated tanks, recalling reports of T-34s with a dismissive smirk, but the first shots changed everything. It began with a distant thump, almost imperceptible at first, like a drumbeat of warning. A T-34 appeared from the haze of smoke, moving with a precision that unnerved even the most experienced panzer crews. The German gunners opened fire, confident that one well-placed round would end the threat. The shell hit the armor and ricocheted harmlessly. A second, a third, all bounced away as if the tank were protected by some invisible shield. "Impossible!" shouted Leutnant Fischer, slamming his fist against the controls. "We've hit it 3 times." From the German perspective, the battlefield had suddenly transformed. Tanks that should have crumpled under their fire stood firm, firing back with deadly accuracy. The 76mm guns of the T-34 tore through the panzer columns with terrifying efficiency. One by one, German tanks erupted in fire, their crews scrambling amidst smoke and screams. Hauptmann Weber cursed under his breath, scanning the field. He had trained for speed, precision, and discipline, but none of that mattered against an enemy he could not predict. Panzer crews huddled inside their steel shells, gripping controls and straps, hearts hammering as rounds tore into the mud around them. The cold, once a nuisance, now amplified every fear. Every sound. Corporal Dietrich, barely 19, watched his best friend vanish in a plume of black smoke as their tank exploded from a single T-34 round. He felt paralyzed by disbelief. It's impossible," he muttered, voice trembling. "How can one tank do this?" Reports began streaming in. Other panzer units were encountering the same nightmare. Reconnaissance had underestimated the speed, the maneuverability, and the armor of the T-34, German commanders tried to adjust tactics on the fly. But every maneuver was anticipated, every flank covered. Panic rippled through the ranks. The men had been trained to dominate the battlefield. Yet here, in the fields outside Moscow, domination was slipping through their fingers. The Soviets, for their part, were calm, disciplined. Tanks emerged from ditches, behind trees and around corners, striking before disappearing again. The efficiency and timing were almost eerie, as though the T-34s moved with an intelligence of their own. Every destroyed Panzer deepened the German sense of helplessness. By mid-afternoon, the first taste of true terror had spread through the German ranks. They realized that Moscow would not fall easily, and that the T-34 was not a mere tank hit, was a revelation, a weapon designed not just to survive, but to dominate. The arrogance that had driven them into the Russian winter was now dissolving, replaced by fear, disbelief, and an unspoken dread. As night fell, smoke curling into the dim orange horizon, the field was littered with the remnants of German armor. The surviving soldiers huddled in their tanks, shivering, listening to distant gunfire and the quiet, unstoppable rumble of T-34s repositioning for the next strike. They had thought the Soviets were weak, that the Panzer was invincible, but the first blood had been drawn. And it was the Germans who were bleeding. The shadow of the T-34 had arrived in full force. And for the men of the Wehrmacht, the realization was unavoidable. The war they thought they understood was slipping into chaos. And Moscow was only the beginning. Snow fell in thick, swirling sheets, coating the battlefield in a blinding white that made every movement a perilous gamble. The German panzer columns advanced with caution, treads crunching over icy ground, engines straining against the frozen mud. Each tank seemed slower, heavier, less certain than it had been weeks ago. Moscow loomed on the horizon, but what had once felt like inevitability now seemed impossible from the tree line. The first T-34s emerged, ghostly silhouettes against the snow, their tracks cutting clean lines through drifts that bogged down the Panzers. The German gunners opened fire immediately, but shells bounced uselessly off the sloped armor. One by one, Panzer after Panzer erupted in fire, engines screaming as molten metal spilled into the snow, painting the battlefield red and black. The sound was deafening, a mechanical symphony of destruction that left soldiers frozen in disbelief. Hauptmann Weber watched as his carefully orchestrated formation dissolved into chaos. "Fall back! Fall back!" he shouted, but retreat was no longer a simple maneuver. The snow slowed their movements, and T-34s struck from unexpected angles, their 76mm guns finding gaps and hitting with deadly precision. German units that had prided themselves on coordination now scattered in panic, leaving burning wrecks in their wake. Inside one Panzer, Lieutenant Fischer clutched the controls, heart pounding. Smoke filled the cabin as the tank's engine shuddered under the impact of a well-placed shot. His radio crackled with frantic messages from other crews, each one a tale of destruction and fear. "We can't hold them," shouted a voice from the line. "They're everywhere." The T-34s moved with uncanny agility, sliding across snowdrifts and plowing through rough terrain that immobilized heavier German tanks. Their crews remained calm, precise, and methodical, exploiting every weakness, every hesitation. For the first time, the German soldiers understood the terrifying truth. They were facing a weapon designed to withstand everything they had to offer. And more, Corporal Dietrich, who had survived the first wave at Moscow, watched as his comrades were cut down one by one, their tanks reduced to twisted metal hulks. He could see the fear mirrored in their eyes, confidence shattered, hope dwindling with every salvo fired by the T-34s. Even seasoned commanders seemed paralyzed, struggling to adapt to an enemy that defied every expectation. As the battle raged on, retreat became inevitable. Panzer crews fled through the snow, engines burning, treads slipping, leaving behind a scarred landscape of frozen fire and debris. The T-34s did not pursue recklessly. They struck with precision, choosing when to appear, when to vanish, maintaining the psychological upper hand as much as the tactical one. By nightfall, The battlefield was unrecognizable. Snow mixed with soot and the blackened remains of German tanks, leaving an eerie silence punctuated only by distant artillery and the occasional roar of a surviving T-34. The Wehrmacht had entered Moscow's outskirts confident and prepared. But they now understood the harsh reality. The T-34 was not just a tank. It was a turning point for Hauptmann Weber and his surviving men. There was no longer laughter, no bravado. Only fear, disbelief, and the dawning recognition that the war was no longer theirs to control. The T-34 had arrived, and with it, the collapse of certainty, the shattering of arrogance, and the grim realization that every step forward would be paid for in blood. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the carnage in silence, as the ghostly tracks of the T-34s etched a warning into the frozen earth. Moscow was not yet taken, but the Germans had already lost something far more valuable: their confidence. The city of Stalingrad loomed ahead, a grim silhouette against the gray winter sky. Smoke curled from bombed-out buildings, mingling with the frigid air that cut through the German uniforms like a knife. The Panzer columns had regrouped after the disastrous encounters outside Moscow, but morale was fragile and every commander knew the lessons of the past months were harsh and unyielding. The T-34s had not disappeared, they had multiplied, striking from streets, alleys, and rubble-strewn squares with relentless precision. Hauptmann Weber surveyed the approaching city with a grim frown. He had hoped that urban combat might favor the Germans, that close-quarters fighting would negate the T-34's advantages. But his optimism vanished as the first tank emerged from behind a ruined apartment block, sliding over debris as though it were pavement, and firing with terrifying accuracy. The 76mm shell tore through the flank of a Panzer, sending metal fragments spraying into the snow. Another German tank tried to flank the T-34, only to be met with a devastating countershot. Inside a wrecked Panzer, Lieutenant Fischer wiped soot from his brow, his hands trembling. "They're everywhere," he muttered to his crew. "Every street, every corner. How are we supposed to fight this?" Outside, Corporal Dietrich ducked as a round exploded nearby, shattering a wall and raining bricks down around him. Urban combat, once a theater for disciplined advancement, had become a nightmare of ambush, misfires, and unpredictability. German generals in makeshift command posts pored over maps, shouting orders that were almost impossible to execute. "Divide the streets! Push the left flank!" They barked, but reports kept coming in. The 34s had blocked streets, destroyed supply lines, and forced retreat after retreat. The Soviets moved like shadows, disappearing into rubble only to reappear where they were least expected. Confidence crumbled as strategies that had succeeded against other opponents failed miserably here. For the men on the ground, the psychological toll was severe. Panic was silent but pervasive. Even the bravest soldiers hesitated before exposing themselves to the deadly combination of T-34 armor and Soviet cunning. Tanks that should have been easily destroyed now loomed like invincible predators, their crews skilled and relentless. Each encounter left a mark, each defeat reinforcing the terrifying reality. Conventional German tactics were powerless, anecdotes spread quickly. One Panzer crew attempted a pincer maneuver, only to be trapped as a T-34 fired from a hidden position, obliterating both attacking tanks within moments. Another crew, seeking cover in a ruined factory, found themselves ambushed as a T-34 rolled silently through a side street, emerging almost magically from the smoke to annihilate their position. The soldiers' initial disbelief had turned into grim acceptance. They were facing something extraordinary, something designed to challenge every assumption they had about armored warfare. Even the seasoned commanders struggled to adapt. Every adjustment, every tactic deployed to counter the T-34 seemed to be anticipated and nullified. The Soviets had turned the city itself into a weapon, and the T-34 was its spearhead. Frustration mixed with fear, and the once confident Panzer crews began to understand that Stalingrad would not be conquered by sheer force or bravado. By nightfall, the streets of Stalingrad were littered with twisted steel, frozen mud, and smoke that hung like a shroud. The T-34s, unseen yet omnipresent, had left a trail of destruction and despair. The Germans had hoped to adapt, to learn, to prevail, but the lesson was harsh and unmistakable. They were facing an enemy that refused to be underestimated, one that would redefine the very meaning of armored warfare. As Weber and his surviving men huddled in a ruined building, listening to distant gunfire and the echo of engines across the snow-covered streets, the stark reality settled in. Victory would not come easily. The T-34 had proven its dominance, and the cost of underestimation was a lesson they would pay for with blood, fear, and every ounce of courage they could muster. The war rooms of the German High Command were thick with smoke, tension, and disbelief. Maps were spread across tables, dotted with red markers representing failed advances, destroyed Panzer units, and regions where the T-34 had struck with devastating efficiency. Officers shouted over one another, each insisting on the superiority of their chosen tactic, yet all were met with the same unyielding fact. The T-34 continued to dominate the battlefield. General von Kleist slammed his fist onto the table, rattling coffee cups and papers alike. "We cannot continue like this," he bellowed. "Our Panzers are being destroyed faster than we can replace them." "How is this possible?" His aides stammered, offering reports and reconnaissance that barely made sense. Every chart, every number, pointed to the same conclusion. German armor was no longer invincible. In the field, attempts at adaptation were underway. New, heavier tanks were being deployed, artillery barrages intensified, and flanking maneuvers recalculated with painstaking precision. Yet the T-34s anticipated every move. Ambush failed, concentrated attacks faltered, and supply lines were repeatedly cut. The soldiers on the ground began to understand that brute force alone would not win this war. They needed ingenuity, courage, and a willingness to confront fear on an entirely new level within the chaos. Acts of bravery shone like flickers of fire against the frozen snow. Corporal Dietrich and his remaining crew maneuvered their damaged Panzer through a narrow street, narrowly avoiding a T-34 ambush while rescuing a stranded infantry unit. Lieutenant Fischer's team held a critical junction for hours, repelling repeated Soviet assaults despite dwindling ammunition and mounting casualties. Every victory, however, was small, fleeting, and purchased at great cost. The emotional toll was visible on every face. Fatigue, fear, and disbelief weighed heavily on the men, and yet there was a stubborn spark of determination. Each encounter with the T-34 reinforced a grim reality. The Germans could no longer take the battlefield for granted. The Soviets had leveled the playing field with design, strategy, and sheer audacity. Confidence had been replaced with caution, arrogance with respect, and in some, a growing sense of dread. As the winter deepened, the German command faced the undeniable truth. Their tactics had to evolve or fail entirely. Panzers were modified with heavier armor and larger guns. Artillery support became more coordinated, and infantry strategies adapted to cover the weaknesses revealed by the T-34. Still, even the best-laid plans often faltered, leaving burning tanks in the snow, and men clinging to life amidst the wreckage. The psychological impact on the troops was profound. Soldiers who had once laughed at the idea of Soviet resistance now moved with deliberate caution, scanning streets and fields for the telltale shadow of a T-34. Every creaking track, every plume of smoke set nerves on edge. Yet, amidst the fear, a new resilience began to form, a grudging respect for an enemy that had forced them to rethink everything about armored warfare. By the end of the campaign season, the Germans had learned the hard way that the T-34 was more than a tank. It was a revelation, a force that had forced them to adapt, rethink strategy, and confront the limits of their arrogance. For every Panzer destroyed, for every failed assault, they had been reminded that the war was not theirs to dictate. The T-34 had turned the tide, and the German commanders could no longer deny it. In the cold, silent nights between battles, men whispered stories of courage, loss, and survival. They spoke of tanks that should have fallen but did not, of Soviet crews who fought with precision and daring, and of the relentless almost supernatural presence of the T-34 on every front. The war had changed. The Germans were no longer invincible, and the battlefield would never look the same again. The fields of the Eastern Front, once scarred with the twisted remains of German panzers, had begun to thaw under the early spring sun. Smoke still lingered, faint and stubborn, as if the battlefield itself refused to forget the carnage of winter. Soldiers trudged across mud and melting snow, weary, battered, and forever changed. The T-34, once a distant rumor dismissed with laughter, had become a legend its shadow, stretching far beyond the frozen plains of Moscow or the ruined streets of Stalingrad. German officers, who had once mocked Soviet armor, now spoke in hushed tones of the tank's brilliance. "It's remarkable," muttered Hauptmann Weber, gazing at photographs of destroyed Panzers beside intact T-34s. "Every inch, every mechanism, it's a weapon designed for survival and destruction in equal measure." The grudging respect was palpable. Pride had been stripped away, replaced by the bitter knowledge that their arrogance had blinded them to ingenuity. Historians would later call the T-34 a turning point in armored warfare, and the soldiers who survived the front lines could attest to its fearsome impact. Sloped armor that deflected shells, wide tracks that conquered mud and snow, and the lethal 76mm gun, it was not merely a tank. It was a symbol of adaptation, of innovation meeting necessity, and of an enemy who refused to be underestimated. The lessons lingered, etched into memory and steel alike. Hubris had been punished. Confidence without understanding proved fatal. The Germans learned to respect strategy, preparation, and ingenuity over raw power. Every maneuver, every assault that had failed against the T-34 became a lesson in humility and adaptation, a reminder that in war, assumptions were dangerous and innovation could turn the tide in a single, decisive strike. Corporal Dietrich, older now, recounted the battles to his comrades. He spoke not only of the terror and loss, but of the skill and bravery on both sides. He remembered the snow-choked streets, the roar of engines, and the eerie precision of the T-34s gliding across impossible terrain. "We underestimated them," he said quietly, "and we paid the price. But that tank, it taught us more than any officer ever could." Even decades later, the T-34's legacy endured. It became a benchmark in tank design, a symbol of Soviet resilience, and a testament to the consequences of underestimating an enemy. For those who had faced it, the T-34 was more than steel, and cannon it was a turning point. A teacher and an enduring reminder that true power lay not just in firepower, but in intelligence, innovation, and unyielding determination. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the plains where once the panzer columns had advanced with arrogant certainty. The battlefield was silent now, but the memory remained, a lasting monument to a tank that had crushed not just machines, but assumptions, pride, and the myth of invincibility. The T-34 had arrived as a machine of war, but it left behind a legacy far greater, a lesson in humility, courage, and the unbreakable spirit of those who dared to build, fight, and survive.